Hi guys, Sony was kind enough to lend me a copy of the 16 to 35 f4, their new PZ lens. It's a power zoom. We say zoom the same in Canada and the United States. Anyway, it is a power zoom lens, 16 to 35 f4. Now here's the thing, I already own the 16 to 35 f4 that was released a while ago, a Zeiss lens. Now can this new lens be good enough to replace my beloved 16 to 35? Yes, it can. I still might not do it because I'm very cheap. So here we are in the studio because this can be used as a studio lens as well. I'm on a 35mm focal length right now. That's what I like for my studio. Gives my face a pleasing, oh, look at this pleasing shape of my face. Now you're not going to get a whole lot of background blur. There's not going to be any bokeh back there to speak of, but you know, a little bit, but just not a ton. And the thing is, normally I shoot at f2 in my studio on a G Master lens. I have a 24mm G Master because I'm a fancy boy and I like that lens a lot. It's one of my main studio lenses. I shoot that on f2. Now I left my lights on the same and I just bumped my ISO to ISO 3200 and I'm still in S-Log3, the old Slog 3, but because the A7IV is really good for the old ISO bump, then I have no trouble using this guy in the studio, even with these fairly dim lights in the back. And here's something interesting. I was doing a test in the back about the warpiness of the corners. I wanted to see if my old f4 lens had a different amount of warp in the corners than this new guy, but something more interesting happened in the test. I'll take you out there and show you now. Okay, first things first. I'm going to compare the lenses directly here in Handsome Alley. Take a look at the corners. Can't get my right hand looking at the LCD screen. There we go. This is the new 16 to 35. I'll try to stay in the exact same spot, switch out the lenses. Wait for it. Ooh, now this is interesting. You see that vignette there? That's because I'm using an ND filter with step-up rings. My ND is an 82mm, so I have stepped down to the 72mm on my old 16 to 35 f4, and you can see a vignette, whereas the wide angle with the other lens, no vignette. So that is a bit of a funny thing. How about that? So let's take those ND filters off then. Now I'm at f8, so there's even less background blur, but does that matter? We're just doing a warpy test here. Okay, so right hand over to the side again. I don't know, I'll check in post, but they seem to be about the same amount of warpiness. So you see that the wide angle at the 16 on this lens, the glass goes too far out to the sides so that if you're using step-up rings, you will see that. Whereas the other guy, it has more of a buffer on the actual lens itself, so when you're applying those step-up rings, you're not going to see any vignetting even at 16mm, and that actually does make a big difference to me because I don't like to buy a ton of ND filters. I like to buy a good ND filter and then use step-up rings to get down to the right focal length there, well, the right filter thread there. If there's banging outside that you can hear, I don't know if that mic is picking that up, it is Canada Day. And my wife, she's out celebrating. She's not the one setting off the fireworks, but she's out celebrating. So I figured I'd celebrate the way I like to, which is staying at home in my basement, drinking apple juice and talking about cameras and lenses. So I thought that was noteworthy. And also, I didn't see any real difference between the warpiness, if that's a real word, of the corners when you compare the old lens to the new lens. Now, because I am a very video-centric and content creator-centric YouTuber, I will be taking the 16 to 35, both of them, this guy and that guy, out to the park, and we're going to do some vlogs and some comparisons of the vlogging and the stability, because this guy is a stabilized lens, whereas this guy over here is not a stabilized lens. Now, will that make a difference? Oh, let's find out. But before we go out in the real world, let me tell you a little bit about the lens. It is a power zoom lens, of course, so you can control that power zoom by a lever, like on a ZV-E10 or an FX3. They have those on the camera bodies themselves. You could control it by a Bluetooth remote, and you can even control it with the Sony app if you so chose. So if you are flying this lens on a gimbal, then it is fantastic for that in that if you want to zoom, somebody else could be doing the zooming for you while you walk around with the lens, or maybe get them to do it. Why are you carrying the lens around? You let them do some work for once. Although that workload is quite light at 353 grams. I have never seen anything like that for a full frame 16 to 35. 353 grams. Sony really is just banging hard at the lightweight internal zooming, which I'll mention in a second. I just mentioned it anyway. But they're going with lenses that are so good for videographers to use, as well as photographers. Optically, these lenses are also fantastic, the new ones that they have been putting out, but it just has that extra bit for the videographers where, you know, if you're a hybrid shooter like myself, it's really hard to move away from Sony right now with the way that they are putting out the cameras and lenses that suit guys like me. So yeah, the internal zoom, like here you go with the dog's lipstick that comes out of these other lenses. This is more than just an eyesore. It is also, you can get dust that gets down in there into the crevices. And also, of course, when you're on a gimbal, if you do this, now you got to rebalance. You do this, now you got to rebalance again. It has like no focus breathing. Sony, again, one of the things that really helps out landscape photographers as well, that like to photo stack. Focus breathing is an issue for those people. And for videographers, of course, focus breathing is a big issue, and there is almost none there's none that I can detect in this lens. And if you have something like an A7IV that has focus breathing compensation, you can even turn that on as well, although there's probably no need with this particular lens that you're looking at right now. Flare control. Now this is great on the new lens. On this guy, not so much. You're going to see some flares that creep in. They're both great with contrast. So with wide angle lenses, you're often going to be shooting, you know, landscapes if you're doing photos. So the sun is going to be in there. And also if you're shooting out in the daytime, then, you know, you get that sun sometimes directly behind someone. So you want to make sure you have good contrast. People can see you. There's no ghosting or crazy flares going through that you don't want to go through. And this guy, he lets in some flares. If you look at this footage right here, this guy is, some flares are creeping in there, whereas they are much better controlled on the newer 16 to 35. Chromatic aberration is well controlled on this lens, and so is longitudinal chromatic aberration. And this lens is quite sharp. It is sharper than this guy, especially with close up focusing, and it's sharper in the corners, it's sharper in the center. It's just a sharper lens. So if you're choosing between these two lenses and sharpness is your main thing, this guy is certainly the way to go. Love the features of this lens. An aperture ring. I love an aperture ring. Clicky and not clicky. It has an iris lock. It has a focus hold button, autofocus to manual focus switch, and the power zoom rocker. I mean, they packed so much into this little lens. Oh, and by the way, you can also zoom with the ring itself. I mean, you can't see the focal range change on the lens, and of course it doesn't extend, but you can zoom it. Now it comes up on the screen. I wish it would come up on the screen of all the Sony lenses when you're at a focal length, because I would appreciate that. But this is up on the screen. Now it depends on what kind of shooter you are. If you're a photographer or a videographer that is always staring at the lens to see what your focal range is, you're not going to be able to see it on that. So that is maybe a learning curve for people. I think it's something you can get used to. But as I show in the vlog that is coming up, when you have a Sony A7 III and you don't have a flip screen, it is nice to have the markings on the lens so you know what focal length you are at without having to go to the back of the camera. You know, but this is for cameras that don't have a flip screen. And since we were talking about the vlogging, without further ado, let's go out into the real world and get judged. So here we have the active stabilization with the 16 to 35 lens that has no stabilization in it. I find that the A7 IV does a pretty good job. This is the third time I've come out to do this stability test. The first time is I had sensor dust all over my sensor, and we all know that Sony sensors are dust magnets, so I should have been prepared for that. Should have had my little blower out for it. The second time, it was my own fault. I had spaghetti sauce on my face, so that one's on me. And this is the third time, and there's people setting off fireworks because it's Canada Day. Serves me right. It serves me right for not getting it right the first time. It's my punishment. How's the stabilization? Is it good? And of course, you can just use Catalyst Browse. I crop in about 10% on Catalyst Browse, and it gives you a little more freedom to move because it corrects quite well in the software. But it is an extra step. You got to go through the old Catalyst Browse process, and usually you want to up your shutter speed to 1/100 or 1/125 because it does weird things with motion blur sometimes, Catalyst Browse. So the active steady shot, when I'm doing A7IV, I usually just go active steady shot. But you can always, you know, if you wanted to fine tune, you can go into Catalyst Browse, fix it up just a little bit. It's up to you. Now this is the A7IV with the active stabilization with the OSS lens, the 16-35 metally OSS, my old f4. And this, I mean, theoretically, it should be a bit more stable, but I find that in all of, because remember, I screwed up a bunch of times, so I got to watch my footage a bunch, and I find that the active stabilization is kind of just doing all the work. The OSS doesn't seem to add much at all when it's paired anyway with the A7IV's active stabilization. It might be different on the A7III, so let's check that out, shall we? Now this is the A7III with the image, the in-body image stabilization, the IBIS. It's on. The steady shot is on, but the lens doesn't have any stabilization. So this is probably going to be too shaky for my liking, even though I've got the gut sucked in and I'm walking as gingerly as I can. But I think that the optical steady shot that is in the old lens may do you better if you have this A7III. Now here we are with the stabilized lens with the A7III, along with its own not very good IBIS. Now I'm still walking extremely carefully because I know that this is not going to be a very smooth setup. I'm also guessing at my framing because it doesn't have a flip screen, so I have to just assume. Now luckily it's a 16mm I'm using, so I'm pretty sure I am in the shot just from experience. And that's another thing, is that the new lens, you have to look at the screen to see the focal length, because when you change the zoom, since it's all internal zoom, which is a great thing for the most part, when you change the internal zoom, you don't know what focal length you're at unless you look at the screen on the back of the camera. With this old style manual type zoom, you know, I just know, oh, my lens is zoomed out, and I can look at the numbers on the top as well. So if you're doing A7III and you want to vlog, things like that, I think this lens, even though it's heavier, is probably a better solution for you. However, I don't think that vlogging with this lens and the A7III is ideal. But if you are just going to do this, then this is what you're going to get, and you can make it work. I just wouldn't recommend moving around a whole lot. So if you are out here in the real world getting judged by all of the people while you vlog, you're going to want a wide angle lens. Personally, I prefer a really small setup like the Sony ZV-E10 with maybe one of the new Sony wide angle lenses for APS-C. So I really do appreciate, I'm going to fix my hair in the viewfinder that I now have in an A7IV. My A7III, no viewfinder. I couldn't tell how pretty my hair was. But anyway, I appreciate the smaller, lighter weight. You can really feel the difference when you have the 16-35. I mean, I am probably not going to switch because of the fact that I'm cheap. I'm cheap and I already have this, and I'm probably not going to get enough for this to get that. But if somebody was to trade it to me straight up, fair and square, I would do it. It's also probably worth less right now because I just dinged it a little tiny bit. I dropped it like a few inches and onto concrete, and it's a metal lens, so the paint chips off on a metal lens really easily. So if you're in the used market and you get one of these things, let's say from me, then you will find some paint chips, and that just happens. It still looks cool in my opinion, you know, like a car. I said this in another video, like a car, like a guitar. Cars don't look cool when they lose their paint, but a guitar, when you play it enough, it looks kind of cool. And I still do like the build quality feel of a metal lens, but it really is quite heavy as a vlogging setup. I will also say that I seem to be a lot more careful with the gear that people loan me. I'm very worried about sending that back in perfect condition, but my own gear, it suffers a little bit, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because this lens, he's been all over the world, this guy that's on the camera here. Gerald Undone probably ran him over in his truck, you know, with the truck stability durability test that he likes to do so much. Now, of course, I can't talk about this lens and how great it is for video, especially on the gimbals, without going for a little gimbal walk myself. I'm on the Zhiyun Crane M3, which is too small for this particular setup. It doesn't balance perfectly. I was hitting the eyepiece trying to balance, so I jimmied it up, and then I pressed auto calibrate, and it went through, so I am using it. I would recommend you step up to a slightly larger gimbal for this particular rig, but I'm doing it. So if you're like me, go right ahead and use your Zhiyun Crane M3. The smaller and the lighter setup I can get, the better. So that's the thing, the motors on a lot of these gimbals are so strong that if you can get it up at all and you press the auto calibrate and it goes through, you're going to be fine. You're going to get beautiful, smooth footage like this. Oh, and I should tell you, this has already paid dividends, having this lens that zooms internally, because I set this up at 35 millimeters by accident. I balanced it at 35, and then I realized no big deal. I just zoomed out, the lens stayed exactly the same, and the weight didn't shift, so I didn't have to rebalance the gimbal. See? It's nice, so I could zoom in and out. Let's go. Hi guys, we'll go with a close-up gimbal walk, huh? Now let's just zoom out while I'm walking. Is that some kind of fantastic cinematic effect? Am I a pioneer in the world of gimbal zooming? So now if you were choosing between the two lenses, this lens or that lens, of course go with the newer one. It is better in almost every way, unless you have maybe an A7 III where you think that the optical stabilization in the lens is going to help you. I can't see why you would get this lens over that lens, with the exception of price. They have now dropped this to $1,000 and this guy $1,200. So you might even get this cheaper than $1,000 on the used market. You know, if you don't mind a few paint chips from yours truly, then, go ahead and get yourself this lens, and you have a very solid wide-angle lens that many professional photographers have used for years. So don't think the quality of this guy is bad. It's great. It's just this thing has stepped it up. But of course, these aren't the only two wide-angle lenses. We have a couple of new players these days, and you got your Tamron 17-28, and now the new Sigma 16-28. And now both those lenses come in at $899. And that is a substantial savings. That is a $300 savings against this lens. And those lenses are f2.8 instead of the f4. So you can use those for things like lower light shooting and astrophotography. Now the Tamron 17-28, out of these three lenses, I wouldn't choose that one because it has the smallest amount of focal range. It goes from 17 to 28, and it also doesn't have some of the switches and buttons that the new Sigma lens has. And the Sigma goes all the way down to 16. I think 16 versus 17 is a substantial difference. So the only reason that you might want to consider this f4 lens over that Sigma lens are things like the lightweight of this. This is 353 grams, and the Sigma is 450 grams. And this guy also goes out to 35 millimeters, which I'm using right now, and the Sigma only goes to 28 millimeters. Now, the Sigma is also an all-internal zoom lens, so that is great for balancing, but you're definitely not going to get away with balancing it on something like the Zhiyun Crane M3, a smaller gimbal. This is going to be a lighter setup for you, and also the focus breathing on this guy might be worth it to you in the fact that there just is none. So anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you haven't already, leave a comment. I will be sure to answer it. Now, if you don't mind, I am going to go hide under my sofa with my cat because I fear the fireworks. I fear them.